Labour MPs just can't stop embarrassing themselves as they struggle to defend implementing some of the worst disability cuts this country has ever seen. Here's MP and Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, on Politics Live.
Just had the impact assessment has just dropped. Now, the average loss for someone on the personal independence payment is £4,500 a year. That's significant, Darren.
I think so I've not seen the impact assessment because, as you say, it's just been published, but my understanding is what the impact assessment doesn't account for is the benefit that you get from our additional money into support for training, skills or work. So take for example, if I said to my kids, I'm going to cut your pocket money by £10 a week, but you have to go and get a Saturday job, the impact assessment on that basis would say that my kids were down £10 irrespective of how much money they get from their Saturday job.
Wow. So comparing disabled people to children that you need to discipline to teach them the value of money, this isn't about incentivizing. Like, we know that cutting these PIP, so as many of you probably know, either because you yourself are on PIP, someone you love is on PIP, or you've read more into it because of this story, basically what the Labour government is proposing is that you cut PIP for people who don't reach a certain threshold. That's always been the case. There's always been a threshold for receiving personal independence payments or any kinds of disability benefits. And they have basically massively increased that threshold. And what that means is that people who aren't able to use the bathroom independently or aren't able to dress themselves independently are now going to be considered well enough to go to work, and not just go to work, but earn enough money to cover all their basic needs, to live a decent life, which those of us who are able-bodied are even struggling to do. And so the idea that Darren Jones it's so condescending, it's so moralizing, it's so it's so lacking in dignity to compare people who require that extra support, to compare them to your children who you're disciplining with pocket money. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting. And unsurprisingly, Darren Jones has been on the apology tour, although I have to add, not for justifying slashing support for disabled people during a cost of living crisis, but for failing to cover up his condescending disdain for those people through his choice of language. And here's MP Dan Tomlinson also letting us know why the disabled, rather than the uber wealthy, should be footing the bill for this country's finances.
I don't know what changes are coming down the track on tax or spend. That's not for me to speculate about. We will see later in the year.
Would you like the wealthy in this country to pay more tax than they currently are?
I think we have to make sure that we don't try and raise revenues from the wealthy and then their wealth just disappears overseas and we all
So because
end up
disabled
poorer.
people can't move their investments, they're the ones that have to foot the bill.
But look, Ben, that is not fair, because as I have explained to you, this modelling today doesn't take account of the fact that our changes, we are confident that, £1 billion extra in employment support, making sure that we're there for people when they need the support. And let me be clear, there are many people who have sickness and disability that mean that they cannot work and they will not be able to work in the future. We will make sure that our benefit system protects them.
So to me, I mean, there's no talking point that I hate more than, well, we can't tax the wealthy because they might leave. Why do we never worry about anyone else leaving or anyone else being dispossessed or anyone else being troubled other than the super, super wealthy, who more often than not, the amount that we're talking about, I mean, we're talking about like a 1% tax on the very, very rich, could, like, a one-off 1% wealth tax would raise billions and billions of pounds. I believe it would fill the NHS funding gap but for 5 years. So we're talking about like a minuscule impact on their on the amount of wealth that they barely even notice it when you're that rich. They're so worried about upsetting wealthy people, the uber rich, an even tiny amount. We never worry about what about these, all the people, all the junior doctors who are leaving the NHS, all the nurses leaving the profession, teachers leaving the profession. All of that no worry about that, absolutely fine. But let a billionaire threaten to move their assets out of the country, which, by the way, most of their assets are already in offshore and are already offshored and are actually not really contributing to the British economy. But then when it comes to disabled people, they should be tolerating whatever we throw at them, no matter how humiliating, no matter how degrading, because they are, I don't know, not as important. I mean, it's very clear that disabled people to the Labour Party, unfortunately, are worth a drop in the ocean compared to the super, super rich. Because when it comes to this balancing the books, they're not willing to just take a 1% wealth tax, which would dramatically transform this country's finances, to people who are billionaires, but they're willing to take away the meager amount of money that people who, again, can't use the bathroom independently, that they rely on to live a dignified life. Now, both of those clips show the direction that Starmer's Labour have gone in. And this is wildly unpopular with Labour's base, but it's also out of step with the general public. Despite ample attempts to demonise people on benefits, just 7% of the British public believe people who have a disability receive too much support. 48% believe they don't receive enough, and 29% believe they receive about the same amount. So that means that probably only that 7% will agree that disability benefits should be cut. Now, one person who probably is in that 7%, someone who is pretty happy with Labour's disastrous welfare policies, is Reform leader Richard Tice.
We've got to dramatically cut huge amounts of wasteful spending and get people back to work. Way too many people have made the calculation that it's better to claim welfare, and the welfare budget is completely, utterly out of control. Work is a great thing. We've got to make work pay.
Do you agree with Liz Kendall that cutting welfare for people on incapacity benefit is a good way to get people to work?
You've got to cut welfare for people who shouldn't be claiming welfare because they've decided to sit at home on their backside as opposed to getting up and going out to work, which is what most of us do, and paying our taxes. It's too easy for too many people who are perfectly healthy not to go to work and to claim welfare. Of course, we want a world-leading benefit system that looks after the genuinely disabled who can't work. Many wonderful disabled people want to work and do work, and that's fantastic, and they should be supported. Look after the genuinely vulnerable and those who are genuinely looking for work. What you don't do is pay the idlers and the skivers to sit at home. That's how you save tens of billions a year.
So that's the vote and the mentality that the Labour Party is courting, calling people on welfare, where, by the way, after 10 years of austerity, the threshold to access welfare is really high, really high, higher than it's ever been. And Labour are what Labour is doing, Labour's programme is pleasing a man who refers to those people, ordinary people, as idlers and skivers. Meanwhile, when you talk, if you want to talk about making work pay, you want to talk about people need to work and, work is good and that we need to reward work. I said this on last week's show and I'm going to say it again. If you have £1 million sitting in an investment portfolio, like a regular savings investment portfolio, and you do nothing, you just leave it in there, that money will make 40 grand in interest over 1 year. That's more than the average salary of a nurse or a school teacher in this country. So if you want to talk about people sitting on their backside and not getting up to work, let's talk about the millionaires and the billionaires and the asset strippers who make money precisely from sitting on their backsides and watching their interest going up for doing absolutely nothing. But those aren't the people that Reform and unfortunately this iteration of the Labour Party are going after. And that tells you everything that you need to know about the grift that is Reform UK. Because their sell to the British public has been, we need to cut immigration to free up resources to spend on the services that people need. So why would they then support cuts to those very same services? If it's really about, close the borders, we need to care for our own, why are they supporting cutting off vital support from the disabled who are amongst our own? Because when you focus everyone's attention on immigrants, it allows them to appear populist whilst distracting from the thing that they actually are setting out to do, which is to slash the welfare state for everyone and hand off whatever is left to private contractors. reform will never actually come out for properly investing in a truly public service or a wealth tax on the super rich, because they are bankrolled by the super rich. When you look at their donors, this is a party by billionaires and for billionaires. And billionaires generally don't invest in political projects unless they think they're going to get a return on their investment. And that return on their investment comes from tax cuts for them, not relatively for the middle class, because they still need to raise money from the middle class in order to service those big private contracts from the state. They also want a return on their investment in the form of slashed employment law. So basically meaning that your employer has more power than ever to, for example, fire you if you refuse to fire you and then rehire you on a worse contract. So it's not actually a surprise to anyone who is genuinely paying attention that this is where reforms stand, because when you scrutinize their actual policies and the actual interests that they represent, rather than just listening to all of the populist bluster, you can see what they actually represent. Now, the circle that I can't square is why the Labour Party, who were elected on the basis of investing in public services, the thing that will actually improve people's lives and provide some firewall against this lurch to the far right. Because for a lot of people who are against immigration, where immigration is leading in this lurch to the far right. Look, some of those people are just ideologically opposed to people who are different to them. Like in some cases, that is it. For a lot of them, it's because they have been told that immigrants are the reason that they don't have access to public services. They have been told that over and over again by our media and by so many of our politicians. And so they're like, okay, well, if closing the borders is how I can make sure that I'm always going to have a home to live in, even if something happens, I become disabled, I lose my job or whatever, I'm not going to end up on the streets. Or if cutting immigration means that I'm going to be able to see my GP, fine, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to believe in. And the fact that the Labour Party would agree with reform on those terms and show all of the ways and instead of showing all of the ways in which reform are using immigration as a smokescreen for their pro-billionaire economic policies, they're choosing to take on the parts of a reform agenda that will be the most harmful to the working class. Helena, welcome to the show. We didn't introduce you at the beginning, but we're so happy to have you now. What do you make of this just circus show that is Labour trying to justify why it is going hard for public services in the middle of a cost of living crisis?
Just wanted to expand on a couple of points with regards to Reform UK's position, and also talk about Labour's strategy with regards to how they're looking at policy and how they're looking at winning voters over. So when it comes to the kind of things that Reform UK talk about, when they say we want to incentivise people back into work by cutting welfare, for example, well, first of all, the idea that you can cut welfare to get people back into work, that hasn't really worked in this country. For example, you look at other countries across Europe that have much less punitive welfare systems than we do. They have much higher out-of-work benefits than we do, and disability payments as well. They actually have higher rates of labour force participation than we do. There's no correlation between the slashing of the welfare state, especially on PIP, which is something that has no work requirement, right? This idea that you can slash PIP to get people into work when a lot of these people are in work and need that to help them stay in work is ridiculous. That's not a successful strategy in increasing labour force participation, even if there were jobs for them to go into, which there currently really aren't. There are more people out of work than there are job vacancies in this country. The statistics just don't add up in terms of how that actually gets people back into work. And they say they want to make work pay, they want to incentivize people into work, yet they voted against the Workers' Rights Bill in the House of Commons. And the fact that they want to support welfare cuts, that's a supply-side labour market reform. That is driving down wages. In fact, if you cut the welfare state, it makes work pay less because the companies have to compete with a smaller remuneration for the welfare state for people who are out of work and looking for work, you know? So these supply-side labour market reforms are bad for workers because they drive down wages. The Reform UK rhetoric is, well, we want to make work pay by cutting the taxes for working people. And whilst I think that that's reasonable in the abstract, in reality, when you look at the utility of cutting these taxes, say, for example, you raise the basic rate at which people start paying income tax. I mean, even Jeremy Corbyn talked about that on Sky News the other day. In reality, that is for everyone across the economy. It's not just the people who are on the low incomes, because that's a tax threshold that applies to everybody. That's going to drastically reduce the overall tax take that can therefore be spent on public services. And if you're part of that cohort that's in the lower end of the income distribution, any amount of tax cut you get from what you currently pay will lead to a greater reduction in public services that you personally receive, that you have access to and that you utilize, because people who don't use those public services are also having their taxes cut and you're more likely to use them. So this is a really good way of selling people the idea of a tax cut, which looks good on paper, but in reality is better for other people than it is for them because of how much you get back from the state. So the bunch of their rhetoric in terms of how they want to make work pay just doesn't add up when you look at the reality of what it's like for people who are on the bottom or who are out of work or who are disabled, for example. None of these things in reality stack up. When it comes to Labour strategy, right? The thing that's really important to understand is that the people at the top of the Labour Party at the moment, so the people who control the direction of which they travel, is the people who are inside kind of the Starmer's Politburo at the top. So that's people like Morgan McSweeney, Pat McFadden, Rachel Reeves, the kind of people from his think tank friends in Labour Together and the Tony Blair Institute and places like that. These are the people who set the direction and strategy in terms of where they look at policy, where they look at messaging. And there was a quote from Morgan McSweeney in, I believe it was The Guardian earlier this week, where he believes that despite Labour's bad polling at the moment, that when it comes down to it, when the rubber hits the road, a bunch of Labour Party core voters will not desert them for the Liberal Democrats or the Green Party or the Workers' Party or the Scottish National Party. They will go back towards Labour to help keep the Conservatives and Reform out, that they will go back to the tactical voting strategy that was kind of the hallmark of what kind of progressive influencers were talking about in the run-up to the last election. So if you have that in your brain, right, that's your kind of your base level in terms of where you think people are going to vote. Well, you think, well, the only place that I can get votes from is the people that we are losing to Reform UK. The reality, of course, though, is they're actually not losing that many voters to Reform UK. I was digging through the internal numbers from recent polling from a bunch of pollsters, but I'm going to focus specifically on the most recent one from a pollster called Find Out Now, because it shows Reform UK with the largest amount of support. And I was looking into the numbers based upon how people voted at the last election. And in reality, the biggest cohort out of where people voted that is now voting Reform UK are people who didn't vote. It's non-voters that are being attracted by Reform UK for their anti-establishment credentials. Obviously, they don't really exist, but that's how they're being talked about by the mainstream media, and that's how they present themselves. They are marketing themselves as a different kind of politics, and therefore they are trying to bring people in who are in the very large pool of non-voters, because the last election was incredibly low turnout, record low turnout, and that's their shtick. That's what attracts people to Reform UK, and that's how they win these people over. So the Labour Party, who are convinced that they are losing people from their own ranks to Reform UK, actually, I don't think that's very true. I was looking at the numbers, and actually the Labour Party voters who are moving to Reform UK, it's around about 7%. It's really not a large amount. There are double the number of people from this poll that I'm speaking of who voted Labour in the last election who are now planning on voting Green in current Westminster voting intention. So they're not losing voters to Reform UK. They are losing people to other parties, and it's Reform UK who are galvanising people who feel let down by politics in general. And if you are maintaining and you are reifying a zeitgeist that demonises the disabled, that doesn't want to tax wealth, and will talk about all of the same kind of narratives that you get from right-wingers, that is going to shut out of the zeitgeist any alternative viewpoint. If the political consensus throughout the main three parties, who take up about 65% of the current voting intention, if there's no opposition to that, it will become rote. It'll become received wisdom, just like George Osborne's cuts did in 2010, when Gordon Brown, Nick Clegg, and David Cameron all run on pro-austerity platforms in 2010, and Labour Party was subsumed by that rhetoric and ran on it in 2015 as well, under Ed Miliband and under Ed Balls as Shadow Chancellor. So everyone was accepting of the austerity narrative, minus the people who were part of the large-scale protests against it. And so that's why David Cameron could win the election back then, because everyone thought, well, he's done a good job with a thing that was obvious you had to do, even though So anyone who knows about economics knew that you do austerity in a liquidity trap, you fiscally expand to ensure that you get investment to grow the economy. And regardless, it didn't matter because everyone believed that to be true. And now with the Labour, Tory and Reform UK all saying that immigrants are the problem and that you should be taking away money from the disabled, the public are going to continue to be led to believe that that is the case. And so not only is it bad electorally to take these lines, because you're not winning anybody over, as current polls show, and you are losing people to your left as well, it also means that the broader Overton window will shift rightwards. And the last thing I want to mention is that this is the fundamental pitfall of the tactical voting strategy from the last election. Labour are always odds on to win. They end up with a giant, unassailable majority in the House of Commons right now. So there's no dissent, right? It would take a huge number of rebel MPs to bring down any legislation towards welfare reform. And that's not going to happen now because these are all people who've been selected as candidates by the Politburo to make sure that they are loyal to the people at the top of the party. They're not going to rebel. And because people all got behind Labour, who said tactical voting was a good thing, a bunch of the MPs that might theoretically be flirting with rebellion know that they don't need to because they have a big cushion in terms of their majority behind a progressive challenger. If there were more people out there threatening not to vote Labour or said they wouldn't vote Labour if they went to the right, rather than saying that they would give away their vote regardless of how right-wing they are, there's no incentive for Labour to try and court their votes anymore. And rebel MPs know that they don't have to worry about losing these votes anyway, and they can not vote with their conscience and vote towards the party whip regardless. So this is a huge strategic failure from people who market themselves as progressive, despite the fact that Rachel Reeves said she wanted to be more pro benefit cuts. She didn't want Labour to be the party of benefits. The literal quote was, "The Labour Party isn't for you if you're on welfare." And despite all these warning signs, they still got behind giving Labour this massive majority, meaning that there is now no opposition, both rhetorically and electorally, and within the House of Commons against this heinous bill, which, again, at this current time of recording, most people in the country don't support. But that number of people who don't support it will dwindle, the number of people who won't support it will increase the more that it becomes the political consensus. And that is the big problem with the entirety of this strategy, in my mind.
Yeah, it's very difficult once these kinds of policies go through to reverse them, although it is possible. But also with Rachel Reeves saying, I don't want Labour to be the party of benefits, which is another way of saying I don't want Labour to be a party of the welfare state. It's like, sorry, but Labour is the party of the welfare state. It invented the welfare state. That's a good thing. And we should stand by that. And if you don't want to be in the party of the welfare state, just be a Tory. But with some of these politicians, I really do think that they just decide they want to be a politician. They flip a coin and it's like, oh, Labour heads, Tories tails. Great, I'll just go wherever the coin tells me. And that's why so many people are dissatisfied with politics.